Serious, what stories about World War II did your grandparents tell you, and or what did you find out about their lives during that period? Something sweet. My grandparents saved all their love letters sent back and forth during that time. They had just met and had fallen in love before his departure, so they carried on their romance and developed the relationship through beautifully written letters. Those letters expressed every emotion, from the realities and horrors of war to the abiding hope they'd be reunited safe and sound. They were married not long after grandfather's return. My grandfather was pretty rich from real estate in the coastal province of Zhejiang in China until the Japanese invaded. He and his family relocated to the inland wartime capital and worked as a telegraph operator for the war. The Japanese took everything from everyone back then, and nothing was the same afterwards. Coupled with a civil war right after, and things were pretty crappy. My grandpa very rarely talked about it, but he was in the Pacific in World War II. He caught malaria and was sent to a hospital ship to recover, and the Japanese sunk the ship, so he floated for like 10 hours clinging to the wreckage, with active malaria, before finally being rescued. And after all that, he re-enlisted and fought in the Korean War also. What a boss. He never said much, but he did talk once about throwing explosives of some kind in a river to catch fish. He was in the South Pacific as a Marine. I just remembered another one. He did not smoke, so he traded his cigarettes till he had enough for a typewriter so he could type his letters to his wife and my mom, his daughter, who was born after he went to war. My grandfather joined up in 1943 when he turned 18 years old. He was stationed on a Pacific island where he basically became a Red O'Reilly. His family were Mennonites, so he was a conscientious objector. He was a medic, clerical worker, cook, ditch digger, driver, and anything else that he was asked. Most of his time was spent cleaning up after everyone else and watching for air raids by the Japanese Air Force. My grandfather befriended a German family during the war. They would cook him meals and the mother would wash his clothes. One day he loaded up a box with eggs and used toilet paper to make sure they didn't break. The next day there was a note in his laundry thanking him for the eggs, but an even bigger thank you for the toilet paper. They hadn't had any in years. Grandfather was drafted, broke his femur in basic training. Spent the entirety of World War II behind a desk in Oklahoma processing logistics and supply chain management requests. My grandfather would talk about the training, time with his unit while being transported, but mostly about a little kid he was helping feed in China after Japan surrendering. He would just think aloud about what happened to him and if he was alright. He never talked about combat. I did walk into his house once and the History Channel was on showing a USMC graveyard on Okinawa and he was crying. My grandfather lost his twin and his mother in a German bombing raid during the Blitz. He was 15 at the time and an alcoholic for most of his adult life. My great aunt told me she and her friends used to play in the bombed ruins of buildings near their home in West London. In retrospect, she realized how dangerous it was to be 3 stories up a crumbling building, but at the time, they didn't care at all. My grandpa stormed the beaches at Point du Hoc in Normandy and lived to tell about it. Afterwards, when things calmed down and they had left France, he ran off for about a week to another country and had some fun. I went back to Point du Hoc with him for a Rangers reunion with my family several years ago. Now that was powerful, standing in the same area with your grandpa and family where he stormed the beaches. If I recall correctly, 225 Rangers stormed those cliffs and 90 remained unwounded by the end of the day. Respect. My grandfather was a kid during World War II. He was born in 1931. He lived in Rugenwald, which used to be part of Germany. Today it's Poland, near the city of Szczecin. His dad had to fight for the Nazis even though they were not particularly fond of their ideas. My grandfather had to go to Hitler Youth, where they would make all sorts of week-long trips through forests, learn how to handle guns, etc. He wasn't able to visit school for some time due to Germany losing the war. My great-grandfather obviously fought the Russians on the Eastern Front, but he was captured on a mission in Russia and kept as a war prisoner when he had a really bad lung infection, and it was becoming clearer that Germany will be losing this war. He was released from prison and was able to spend 3 more days with his family before he passed. Then it was my grandfather's turn to try and earn some money as he was the only son they had and his mum had to take care of his youngest sister. When Russia took over the whole area, they gave the Germans in the area the chance to leave for Western Germany. They provided one train and said whoever could get on there was free to go. The rest would stay there. My grandfather made sure that his family got on the train, but he didn't have any space himself. So he rode the train by standing on the metal bar thing that connects two train wagons for part of the journey. Luckily the train didn't run too fast. Once Hitler came to my grandfather's hometown earlier in the wartime and he said everyone was so excited to see this man. People literally camped by the train tracks to await his train. Apparently he came by train for some reason. There's plenty more. Since my granddad basically had to flee his hometown and had never returned, he asked me and my dad, his son, to take him there a couple years back, since he would love to see how it's turned out. He was already over 80 years old. Of course we were happy to go and we spent 9 days there. Some of it was quite emotional for him and he told me many stories of his childhood. It was really interesting to hear his point of view as he was a child for the most part. As I understand it, Hitler had his entire command structure in a train in the early years of the war and they'd move close to wherever they were invading next, so the lines of communication were shorter. Grandpa and Grandma were out in Austria. Grandma was super pregnant with my aunt. They were stumbling through the forest when they met 5 Afro-American soldiers. Might have been the first time they've seen black people. One asked Grandpappy to come closer. No common language, just by using hand signs. They both thought that that's the end. They're done. It's scary to run into guys with big guns in the forest. Turns out, they got a bunch of eggs in exchange for some help at a nearby farm. And when they saw Grandma's big belly, they thought she'll be needing the extra calories more than them. So they put it all into Pa's hat and pointed on Grandma, smiling. Best dudes ever. My grandmother's cousin saw a black person for the first time during World War II too. Apparently she had no idea they existed, and in the Bible white is angel and black is devil, so she freaked out, thinking she had just seen the actual devil. My great grandfather never talked about the war until he had his stroke. We knew he had a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, but we didn't know how he got them. He was just a private, and he'd had enough of the military when the war was over. After the stroke, he seemed to loosen up. He laughed about sighting rifles and by shooting at chickens. He showed us pictures of him in front of the Eiffel Tower. Turns out he was occupation force. Ended up occupying an area near Berlin that became involved in the Battle of the Bulge. Apparently, while he was fighting, some sort of explosive blew off his buddy's leg. So Grandpa did what anyone else would do and threw his buddy over his shoulder to get him to the med tent. This included running across a field in the line of sight of a German machine gun nest. He was shot in the leg and some more shrapnel ended up in his chest. Somehow, Grandpa and his buddy survived. We thought he was embellishing it, but the Bronze Star paperwork included a report that we found after he passed away. 2 higher-ups signed that the story was true, so I guess I have to believe it. He told us it wasn't that big of a deal and that he didn't deserve all those medals for what he did. What a badass. R.I.P. Gramps. Ended up occupying an area near Berlin that became involved in the Battle of the Bulge. That area is 700-800 kilometers from Berlin. Sounds like Gramps was a badass nonetheless. My grandpa went to Annapolis during the war and ended playing piano for the Uzo. It might not be badass, but it's still kind of cool. Got 2 stories. Grandmother on my mom's side told me this story. I remember first time when the Germans came into my village. I was outside playing with my cousin when my mom came and pulled us into the house and said, "SSH. Be silent, the Germans are here." We stood by the window that had a little opening and saw how German soldiers walked on the road with tanks and knocked on people's doors and pulled some of them out. I saw my neighbor get shot on the spot. I was 5 years old and still remember it clearly. Grandmother on my dad's side. We lived just by the Danube and I remember seeing the Germans on the other side of the stream. They started to board some small boats to cross the river. After some minutes they started to shell and shoot towards us and I took my little brother in my arms and started to run for my life. I was 9 years old and my brother 4 inches. They didn't care how we look like or not. They hated us because we are Slavs and not Germans. My grandmother on dad's side was redhead, Irish redhead. My grandmother on mom's side was blonde and green blue eyes. 2 stories that stuck the most. Pacific Theater, Southeast Asia, Japanese occupation. Granddad was a small boy. At the beginning of the occupation, he didn't know he has to bow to any soldiers he passes. One day, the soldier called him over, gave him one tight slap across his cheek and ear. He went permanently deaf in that ear. The only thing my grandpa ever said about the war was how he made his engagement ring out of a quarter using a tablespoon. I assume he saw some crap. I did however meet a Nazi airplane mechanic. 90 years old and dude still had all his wits about him. Interesting convo. American quarters were mostly silver back then, so that would actually be a pretty decent engagement ring, and I imagine silver is soft enough to work with a tablespoon. That's pretty freaking resourceful. My father was a medic in World War II and was part of the Normandy invasion, where he had to do what he could with pieces of soldiers. It must have been horrifying. On his deathbed he admitted that he stole 2 small bars of silver from the body of a German soldier somewhere in France. He wasn't proud of it, and in fact he was quite ashamed of his actions even 60+ years later. When he returned home he sold the silver, and in a small way it helped him purchase a small trailer in which he and my mom lived while he finished college. The bars were probably stolen by the German guy too. It's not like people bring their precious metals to war. My grandfather served on a destroyer for the US and saw action in the Pacific Theater in Korea. One story I vividly remember is him telling me they had to assist in recovering downed US pilots from the ocean. He said many times the pilots were already dead and had been mutilated by sharks. He said he would never forget pulling those men out of the water. My great-grandfather died in the Netherlands fighting when my grandpa was 1 year old. My great-grandmother never spoke about it even up until she died, and it was only cleaning the house my grandpa found the Purple Heart and other memorabilia tucked away. She never remarried. Recently my dad and I went to the Netherlands and got the chance to visit the American cemetery there to see where he was buried. It was touching and sad. My dad had never met his grandpa, and his dad could never make it over there at this point. We rubbed sand into his name on the gravestone and planted flags. Talked about him. He died in 1945. My grandfather, a 6'6" red-headed Irishman from New York, was a lieutenant in charge of an anti-aircraft battery at Normandy. That's not the interesting bit though. As the Allies advanced into Europe they took a number of prisoners, who all spoke German. Obviously, my lieutenant grandfather was put into a private's uniform and stationed outside the POW camp. Why? Because my 6'6" red-headed Irishman from New York grandfather was the son of a German immigrant and spoke fluent German. He got a lot of intel from the prisoners who spoke German freely in front of the American. My grandparents were children during World War II. They lived in a small country that was about as far away from the war as was possible. It aligned with the Allies, but the country was so remote and so small that it really couldn't contribute much to the war regardless. You would think this would mean that everything would be peaceful and great, right? Their country was still suffering heavily from the worldwide economic depression that had propagated out from the US. In the mid and late 30s, the Great Depression plus the disruption in trade from the war aggravated things into a massive famine in their country. Grandpa said that the economy was non-existent. Therefore there was no money and no food. Often his parents had to travel 5 miles with their children, on foot. There was no gasoline left to run cars to a food distribution center run by the government because there simply wasn't enough to eat. He mentioned how more than once he would be walking in the streets and he'd see a person who had starved to death. But this was routine enough that it stopped being shocking to anyone. My grandmother had more troubling stories. She said many girls and women, married or single, as young as 10 and as old as 80, middle and lower class, God-fearing or not, would turn to prostitution to afford food. Often their payment for sex was simply a morsel of food. Their biggest clientele were local and out-of-area priests. Some girls didn't want to stoop that low, and ended up being some of the starved people that would be found dead on the streets eventually. World War II was terrible for many countries, either directly or indirectly. Light-hearted story. My grandpa was an MP, military police. When the soldiers got in bar fights and they needed to call the MP, he would get sent out to break it up, load them into the jeep and take them back to base. He said they would drop them off at the gate. If they were sober enough to walk back to barracks on their own, they were free to go. If they were too drunk they would have to take them to the brig. These soldiers were under a lot of stress. I think it's a pretty cool thing that he bent the rules for some of these guys. My grandmother was a Jew in a Nazi concentration camp. She was pretty much certain to die because she didn't have a job and she wasn't cunning enough to survive on her own. It was rough. One day some local farmers in Russia bought her to work for them during the day. So she would go to the farm to work during the day and come back at night. The farmers would feed her and clothe her. They also helped her sneak food into the camp. Often, I don't know how, she would sneak soups into the camp to give to her friends and family. The farmers were endless in their kindness and helped her survive until the Nazis were defeated and everyone was released. My grandmother was reunited with her family and lived a long life until she died last year. Without the farmers' kindness, I don't think I would be here today. Your grandma is a hero. She could have survived just fine without any risk of getting caught if she didn't sneak in soup for her mates, but she did anyway. Meddling when you don't need to is the essence of being a hero. Elon Einstein 1764. G'day mate. This is Doggo from Australia. What is your cringe story from school? If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to Updoot Reddit. If you are new to the channel, I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day you magnificent people.